Zoom was more intuitive in that sense, but I think it was just more familiar.
So, I think, perhaps we should start now then, I think. Right, so I believe that Thomas, you're going to speak first. And Thomas Charrayre was a student at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and currently he's a doctoral candidate in political theory at Sciences Po, also in Paris. His research focuses on the intellectual history of conservatism, with particular attention to the relationship between conservative thinkers, liberalism, and communism during the Cold War. He's particularly interested in the thought of Leo Strauss, Michael Oakeshott, and Raymond Aron. In 2025, he was visiting fellow at the Faculty of History in Cambridge, and that was when I had the pleasure of meeting you, and we had a long discussion, which I'm still thinking about, which is why I'm looking forward to this paper particularly. Thomas is publishing a paper co-authored with Arnaud Miranda, which is called A Thin Line, Distinguishing Between Conservatism and Reaction. And his paper today is titled, and I think the tense here is interesting, what was conservative democracy? So over to you.
Yes, well, thank you very much, John. I wanted to thank you for the invitation. And I'm really glad to speak in front of everyone today. And also thank you, Aaron, for the organization. I can share my screen, right?
Yeah, the option should be there.
Yes. So yeah, this should work fine. So yes, the question I am trying to answer today is what was conservative democracy? And the question did not really start as what was conservative democracy. It really started as where have all the conservatives gone? I'm not going to try to sing it, but really the question was prompted by the fact that I am not quite old yet. And when I grew up, being conservative really was almost, especially in France, synonymous with being liberal. And yet here I am after starting my dissertation, and wherever you see a conservative intellectual, there is a huge possibility that you will see him call for a regime change. And I think Christian is going to talk a bit more about this, and Patrick Deneen. But I think that Patrick Deneen is a good illustration of someone that you would consider to be a conservative intellectual, someone that proposed in some of his earlier books something really close to the Benedictine option, which is something you can find in, let's say, Alasdair MacIntyre's book, and really something that you would see some conservative intellectuals call for. Yet calling for regime change seems to be something really different, because if you just take someone as Edmund Burke, who is usually considered to be, if not the father of conservatism, at least an important reference for conservative, well, you find in this very famous passage of the reflections on the revolution in France, this quote: "The very idea of the fabrication of a new government is enough to fill us with disgust and horror." So if we follow Burke, the very proposal that Deneen is making should fill us with disgust. And so the idea here is that really something must have changed for people that were or are still or still consider themselves to be conservative to be calling for regime change. And that is what prompted my interrogation. So I will be trying to answer the question in 3 parts. Very French of me. In the first part, I will building on the paper that John mentioned. I will try to clean a bit the distinction between conservatives and reactionaries. Then I will move to the question of the 30s and the cauldron of the Cold War, where I will explain that what we call conservative democracy, or what we see, what we used to call conservatives, is actually something that is a very peculiar phenomenon, very limited in history, and very much linked with the 30s and the Cold War. And I will explain that the kind of conservatism you could see emerge during the Cold War was a kind of conservatism that was really peculiar, because it is non-traditionalist kind of conservatism. It is the more philosophical part of the argument, so I will leave some room for this. So let's start with the difference between conservatives and reactionaries. I think that when you look at the question, where have all the conservatives gone, you can simply give two kind of answers. The first one could be that you can say that some conservatives, let's say someone like Patrick Deneen, became a reactionary. So he is not a conservative anymore. And if we don't see that much conservatives anymore, it's because they simply have converted to reaction or to something else. The other answer, and I feel that it would be the answer given by someone like Patrick Deneen, is that conservatives never really supported liberal democracy. They might have supported a kind or a form of democracy. They are not allowed non-democratic thinkers, but democracy was never really central to them. And so you can't say that there was something like conservative democracy. So their answer would basically be that we mistook some conservative inclined liberals for true conservatives. So if we want to make a distinction between reaction and conservatism, I think it's always quite useful to come back to let's say someone like Michael Oakeshott. His definition of what it is to be a conservative is open to a lot of criticism, but I think that in the list of things, in the things he lists, the idea that to be a conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, and especially the actual to the possible, is really something that most conservative would admit to. Is that the present is what we have, and thinking about utopian projects, whether inspired by the past or by a utopian idea of the future, both of this way of relating to the world and to politics is not something that conservatives are inclined to be. On the opposite side, the reactionary is someone that is really not at ease in the present. The example I took is Julius Evola, because he was writing roughly at the same time as Michael Oakeshott was writing, so there is kind of an overlap. And in Ride the Tiger, you can see that he clearly states that the reactionary should not become fixated on the present, and he should simply let the forces and the processes of our epoch run their course. So it's really something that you would see, let's say, if you read Patrick Deneen, it's something you will encounter there. Liberalism has failed. It is on the verge of failing. We just have to wait for the moment where liberalism will be weak enough to replace it with something new. You simply have to, in some ways, tire the tiger of liberalism if you're a reactionary. But if you limit yourself to this distinction, you might have a clear-cut distinction between, so that the conservative is focused on the present, and if he relates to the past, it's in a way that the past is embodied in the present, whereas the reactionary is not at ease in the present, and if he has a relation to the past, is because the past is a proof or has some traces of greatness, and so the past is more like a testimony to the possibility that things weren't always like what they are now. So I think that's a nice distinction. But when you look at some other political concepts, and the one we are interested in today, democracy, well, the distinction is not as clear-cut. Let's say if you take the example of Joseph de Maistre and Edmund Burke writing at the same time on the revolution, most of the time, or usually in textbooks or handbooks, you would see Edmund Burke on the side of conservatism and Joseph de Maistre on the side of reaction. But when you look at the idea of popular sovereignty and democracy understood as popular sovereignty, both of them seems to be perfectly in line. So de Maistre is very known for this quote where he says that of all monarchs, definitely the people is not the one you want to be ruled by. And on the opposite side, Burke is also stating the same thing. A perfect democracy understood as absolute popular authority is the most shameless thing in the world. And it's not just to say that in the reflections on the revolution in France, there is a condemnation of perfect democracy, but you will find a lot of arguments to explain why the people are not the ones that are qualified to govern in any meaningful way. The only really meaningful way Burke recognizes democracy is established democracy, and by this he is referring to town charters and things that really don't point to what we today call democracy. So if we want to look at a moment in time where you can clearly start to distinguish between conservatives and reactionaries around the topic of democracy, the moment where democracy is not something they both agree on is something bad, it's probably the switch from the 30s to the Cold War. So overall, I won't go deep in the details, but conservatism, despite the fact that Edmund Burke might be considered an important influence, or other thinkers such as Tocqueville, well, outside of this and outside of England, conservatism is really almost a contemporary phenomenon rather than a modern one, in the sense that it's really hard to pinpoint to conservatives in France, or at least to a conservative party, because the conflict between the idea of a republic and the liberal democracy and the idea of monarchy was yet to be decided. So England is really, it's just to remind that England really is a peculiar place on earth, and the US too, regarding this history of conservatism. The second thing is that if you look at the handbook of someone like Michael Freden, conservatism is very close to liberalism in the way it defines it. From what we saw right before with Burke and de Maistre, it's really not totally something you can see at the end of the 18th century or the start of the 19th. So the turning point is really the 30s for me. And I think I can give a good example with this infamous letter from Leo Strauss. So it's not during the 30s that you see conservative converting to democracy. You see quite the opposite, especially if you look at Germany or France. Conservatives there are really convinced that democracy is going to be replaced by something different, and that you will see a comeback to imperial rule. And Leo Strauss is part of this phenomenon. As you can see, it's an infamous letter because when he's discussing with his friend Karl Löwit about the fate of Jewish people in Germany, he is saying that it's only from the principle of the right, that is from fascist, authoritarian, and imperial principle, that it is going to be able to protest against the shabby abomination. The shabby abomination here to evade some kind of overseeing of his correspondence is referring to anti-Semitism. And he is clearly saying that he does not want to appeal to the revolutionary ideals or to the democratic ideals of the rights of man. And what's the reason there? I think it's quite clear in the quote itself is that why would you, as a conservative, call or look at democracy if what you're looking for is the protection of law? And from his standpoint in 1933, it's the reference to Roman thought that is going to be able to protect anyone against the arbitrary use of power and of authority. So you can of course say that it is a terrible letter in the sense that it was really, really wrong in its conclusion. But I think it explains well why the turning point was the 30s. It's because it's the last moment where you can see a shift from the idea that, well, democracy might not be at all the best system. And democracy especially can be replaced by its own opposite, that is, the reliance on popular sovereignty will only bring about an authoritarian regime that will restore the Roman principles. And so it's at that point, it's with the horrors of fascism, but also the fact that fascism lost the war, that something different will be born inside of the conservative tradition, I think. So Aron is quite a good example in this case, I think, because in right after he defended his own dissertation, he was invited in front of the French Philosophical Society to give a conference titled Democratic States and Totalitarian States right before the war. And you have to imagine that the intelligentsia at the time in this society is very liberal or communist or socialist. And in front of this whole crowd, he is going to say that totalitarian regimes are genuinely revolutionary, whereas democracies are essentially conservative. Aron, before this moment, Aron was never considered as a conservative. He might have been considered as a strange kind of socialist, someone imbued by the ideal of a European Union, even sometimes being friend and being very close to people that would then participate in the Vichy government. So his conversion kind of to conservatism is a conversion that is based on the very idea that totalitarian regimes are revolutionary. So that democracy inside of the French Revolution, what you would see as the connection of revolution and democracy, was not something that needed to be connected. And what he is basically saying is that, in fact, the reliance on popular sovereignty is not something really democratic. It's something purely revolutionary. And so using popular sovereignty to establish something different than democracy is going to be, or to accomplish something revolutionary, not something conservative. But at the same time, he's stating, and you can still see the ambivalence between all of this, and something that makes him not liberal is that he's saying that despite the fact that democratic regimes are threatened by totalitarian regimes, they must not turn to liberal values. They must turn to the virtues of totalitarian regime. And those virtues are not, he is of course not referring to anti-Semitism and this kind of virtues, or values, sorry. Is referring to military virtues, masculine virtues, elitist virtues. That's the kind of virtues he's referring to. So I think that it's from this point on that the situation really changed for conservatives, because that's where we see the emergence from this temptation of a reactionary revolution, what was called in Germany the conservative revolution. So this temptation to follow this path that emerged a conservative understanding of what democracy was. And a conservative democracy is very close to a liberal democracy, but I think that it is it is quite easy to understand where it is not the same kind of democracy exactly. It can coexist because it's applied to the same historical reality, but what conservative philosophers there highlight are not the same thing that liberal philosophers would highlight. So the first thing they highlight, and that's the case for Arendt, that's the case for Oakeshott, that's the case for Strauss, is legality. Legality can be and must have been seen as exactly the same thing as the rule of law by liberals, contemporary liberals to these thinkers. But what they really mean by this is rule by law. So the difference is not enormous, but it's really the idea that authority and political authority should not really be limited by law, but that it should always try to act and make its acts lawful. So what's the idea behind this is that, well, the regime from the 30s, that's all of them, they used legality. So they use the language of rights. So you can't just democracy can't just rely on the affirmation of the rule of law, because it's going to be used by tyrannies or would-be tyrants to conquer power. So legality is very different because I think what really matters there is that legality does not share the same liberal opposition between a rule of law and a state of exception. With legality, you can always reintegrate the state of exception inside of the legal system. So I think that all of them are trying to relativize the importance of the state of exception, opposite to someone like Carl Schmitt, but also opposing to the kind of denial of the state of exception you see in liberal thought. A good example for Raymond Aron is going to be support for de Gaulle. He spent almost his whole life calling each time de Gaulle a would-be dictator, but every time that de Gaulle used his power, in fact, not to affirm his own position, but also to affirm the continuity of the Republic, Aron was satisfied, even though each time he was frightened in some way. The second point, and I think it's the insistence on the elites, that all of these people really are convinced that a democracy does not really mean equality. Democracy needs equality, but it can also coexist with some kind of elites, especially representative elites. And I think that what they saw in the 30s is a distinction between popular democracies and representative democracy. Something that they clearly share with liberals, but they give it an elitist twist, kind of. The third point, and I think this point is much more important in Oakeshott and Aron than in Strauss, but it's the importance of a peaceful political competition. Democracy gives way to a kind of political competition that can be peaceful. And Aron has a really good saying about this, is that a conservative democracy is a democracy where a conservative party wins and a progressive party wins after the conservative party has won. Why is it important for him? It's because both parties can feel like they have lost, and both of them can present themselves as winner. So all of them are always dissatisfied, but none of them is convinced that they never won at some point. So the dynamic here for him is really important. The idea is that politics can't do a lot of things. That's a very conservative idea in itself. But especially in modern societies, politicians will have very little power over the global trend of economic or technological change. And so the political competition is going to be a way to integrate historical change in a structure where no parties can be deemed totally responsible for it. The Conservative Party can always point at a progressive party to say that the bad changes that have happened are the results of the progressive politics. But at the same time, the progressists can always claim that if change didn't really brought the social justice or all these ideals brought them into reality, it's because there was a conservative party that devoided these changes of their emancipatory possibilities. So the idea is really that nobody is going to win through this, but both parties can always point at someone for the reason. They can't be deemed to be responsible of what they deem to be the bad things in historical change. And finally, the last point in this conservative democracy is the insistence of Aaron, Oakeshott, and Strauss on liberal education. Liberal education is really important for all of them. And we'll talk a bit more about this in the conclusion, because it is something that is able to maintain a sense of continuity, but a sense of continuity that can be protected from change. That is, technological and economical change is going to happen. Political or geopolitical change is also going to happen. That's not something you can really claim to be conserving, because you are always threatened by forces that are beyond human control or beyond the control of politicians. But in the case of liberal education, the transmission of knowledge by its very own structure is something that is conservative. Is that you can always teach and keep teaching the same things. So I think that they really displace the notion of conservation to the realm of education. I think all of this end up being a kind of theory of the autonomy of politics rather than the primacy of the political. Sometimes it can sound like they are really close to decisionist thinkers such as Schmidt when they describe the political. But they always describe the political to, I think, claim that politics should be considered as an autonomous realm, not as a primary realm, but as an autonomous realm, so that the influence of politics on the rest of the other spheres of human life can be limited. So I think that's here where we see what institutionally a conservative democracy looks like. Well, why is this very peculiar in the conservative tradition? I think it's very peculiar because it's a non-traditionalist kind of conservatism. Usually, as we've seen, conservatism is associated with Burke. And in Burke, even though Burke is a bit more than simply just traditionalist, what people, and especially people that claim to be conservative, use in Burke's thought is his historical traditionalism or his evolutionary traditionalism. The idea here is really that the knowledge we have, the values we have, all of this is the product of an historical process of evolution and selection. So if our constitution, if the English constitution is a great condition, it's because it has been sanctioned by time. And the idea is really that we don't need to, there is no real need to justify all values, because these values are justified by the fact that we have inherited them. And the strength of this kind of traditionalism is, at the same time, its very weakness is that you can't really claim that a part of a tradition is something that won't change, because, well, tradition as an evolution is always changing, but you still deem that you have to accept all of this tradition as a part of an evolutionary process. But that's weak in this sense, but that's very strong for the same reason, is that you don't really need, you kind of have an extra normative criterion of why our values are important and we should conserve them. We should conserve them because they are validated by history. The other kind of traditionalism is much different and much often, more often associated with the reaction, but not only. It's the kind of religious traditionalism. There, the notion of tradition is not an historical tradition. Tradition is the tradition of revelation. So it's the revelation that has been transmitted since it has been revealed. Since it has been given to man. And the idea there is that tradition is not something that changes, even though the magister can change about, like, the teaching about this tradition can change somewhat, but the very idea is that what is being transmitted is always the same universal truth that has been given to humanity. And this kind of tradition is very different because it finds its normative value in the fact that you believe in, or that you ought to believe. Is that it's because it is not man-made, but it has been willfully made by God that you have to follow the tradition. So those are the two kinds of traditionalism. And I think that all the philosophers I've mentioned do oppose this kind of traditionalism. So I gave you a quote by Leo Strauss in Natural Right and History, where he has a damning chapter on Burke, where he's at the same time very emphatic about the fact that Burke was a great embodiment of conservative values, but he's at the same time affirming that Burke had a terrible way to defend these values, because if tradition is justified by the internal value of the very process of evolution, then there is no reason to affirm that one tradition is better than any other. But also, you have no clear justification to say that you should go against the spirits of the time, especially because if at some point a tradition has changed so much, then you have no historical traditional way of defending the fact that you should return or go back to this tradition. The other justification you find against what Oakeshott here calls divine endowment is that, well, civil power or the civil government cannot be derived from any other kind of sphere other than the civil sphere itself. Is that what is the meaning of political power, and what is happening inside of politics is the fact that we obey because we obey to laws because we feel like we are obligated to do it. And it's something that is part of the very notion of a rule. And so the fact that we obey to rule is not because there is something beyond the rules, but because we are following those rules. So it can seem in some ways like a very circuitous reasoning, but I think it maps out really well with what I've said about conservative democracy. So you are not accepting democracy because you have a reason to accept democracy beyond democracy. You're accepting democracy because it is there and it serves as a system of lawful government where it can or cannot meet transcendent standards, but you don't have to judge democracy, or you don't have to, the fact that you accept or don't accept democracy is not linked to those transcendent values. Well, so one last quote by Raymond Aron, just to say that he is bringing all of this together, is that once church and tradition were questioned or rejected and the sovereignty of the people proclaimed, all parties and social groups were drawn into an ongoing debate about the regime, most in accordance with prevailing ideas. So the basic idea to the question where what was conservative democracy. I think conservative democracy really started with the acceptation of the fact that you can't do away with the sovereignty of the people. And if you can't do away with the sovereignty of the people, democracy is the best way to deal with the sovereignty of the people, because you have many, many ways to limit the sovereignty inside of a democracy, ways that you don't find in all of the other alternatives. So here we come to the conclusion. I hope we'll have some time for the discussion. I think that, yes, so the first thing in the conclusion is that conservatism, and especially the post-war conservatives are really peculiar. One reason why they are so peculiar is because conservative democracy there sounds less like a democracy for the conservatives, or a conservative understanding of democracy, but much more like a theory of politics. So it's not something you can really use to defend a political ideology, even a conservative political ideology. So it's probably a good thing for a political theory. But it might be a problem for conservatives themselves if they feel like they have an agenda to push. So I think that in this way, it's easy to understand why some conservatives today would want to get rid of this way of thinking about politics. The second thing is that all of this is clearly tied to the Cold War. Is that the idea that a functional conservative democracy is a liberal democracy where nobody can keep power and can change democracy into a substantive machinery into one direction is clearly something that is tied to the Cold War, in the sense that you can accept liberal democracy because the conservation of liberal democracy is the way you're going to defeat, or if not defeat, avoid the extension of communism all over the world. So whether it's in Aron or Strauss, you really find decided that the worst possible outcome in the 20th century can be a world state. And I think even though you find less references in Oakeshott about this, is criticism of rationalism in politics is really also targeted at this kind of world politics. And finally, the last 10 point, no, not the last 10 point, but the last point, it's the place of liberal education. I think the huge difference between people like Patrick Deneen and those kind of conservative Cold War philosophers is that they really don't have a substantive understanding of liberal education, but a very formalist one. There is one quote about Leo Strauss where he says that liberal education is in itself not really important, because whether Marx or Nietzsche, both of them had a far better liberal education than anyone in the 20th century, and it did not stop them from doing something that people don't think is substantively tied to liberal education. But liberal education should not be seen from their perspective as something that is going to produce a certain kind of belief or a certain kind of people. It's much more about transmitting a whole tradition, but with no substantive outcomes. And I think that it's also something that you can see as a big change in the way people now relate to liberal education. That is, all the conservative entrepreneurs around liberal education are really trying to sell the concept as something that can bring substantive change to society. So, well, thank you for your attention. I hope it wasn't too hard to follow. Thank you very much, and I can't wait for your questions.
Thank you enormously for that, because packed in lots of material and lots of different strands, but also sort of nicely kept it to time so that there's plenty of opportunity for questions and comments. And it's those that I'll invite now. I mean, best, either you can put your hand up physically or best perhaps by the hand on screen. So I see Lawrence immediately has a hand up. So please ask your question.
Thomas, thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. Something that I have been pondering for a long time is this question of whether or not there is a conservative philosophy as such. And I know that's why John brings us together to ask this question. Because it seems essentially, I mean, and I was fascinated by the figures that you lined up as well. I mean, to line up Löwit and Strauss. And of course, there's a great deal built into that question between Löwit and Strauss. I don't know the history of that quote, but Löwit began life. Martin Heidegger, Löwit was Martin Heidegger's pupil, and Martin Heidegger once complained about Löwit that he used to come in and out of my house as the reddest Marxist, rotester Marxist, he says. And nowadays, he's all evangelical Lutheranism. But of course, Löwit was also, under the Nuremberg racial laws, Jewish and was exiled from Germany to Rome. And I wondered if that embracing of the cross was a rebuke from Strauss for where Löwit had ended up. But I don't know, and I'd be grateful if you'd comment on that, because clearly it's a controversial remark. But the hardest philosophies to describe are those which are negative, as it were. And I don't mean negative in the sense that they have negative consequences, but rather they are not ideologies. So liberal, it seems to me, liberalism of its nature is projective. It's Kantian, and it springs out of the German idealist position as that which projects forth in order to do its ordering. It posits. It demands that freedom is accomplished in this way or that way. And my only question to you is that because I'm the other person whom I've studied in this area is that master of the conservative revolution, Ernst Jünger. Now, Ernst Jünger loathed, I mean, when we translated Der Arbeiter, his work, The Worker, I mean, I fell about laughing in the passages where he describes the bourgeois. The bourgeois class is often described, I mean, certainly from a Marxist point of view, as the most conservative class. And yet Jünger hated the bourgeois as not conservative class, but actually the most operational, the most positing, in other words. These are the ones who will always do a deal. He says they never stop talking. In fact, their job is to keep the conversation alive in order that they can sneak themselves in to the gaps in the conversation. And so why I ask this question about a negative philosophy, because it seems to me that what's inherent to conservatism is that it constantly brings things into order rather than posits what order should be. You'll understand this is a negation of positing. Solon says we are swept around by winds on all sides, but when the wind subsides, that is when the sea is at its most. And then he uses the word dikaiotatos, which we want to translate as most just, but it can't possibly, seas can't be just. What he means by that is most brought into order with itself. That's what he has in mind. Water, when it relaxes, when it isn't pressured from other directions, falls into its own inherent relations. And it's clear he's talking about the political situation in Athens and about what he aimed to do. This is a philosophical position, but it's one that's very hard to describe. It's not easy at all. It's very easy, especially with modern students who all want to make a difference, to give them the means to posit that difference. Whereas when you say to them, I don't want to make any difference at all. In fact, the best thing I can hope for is to leave things in as good a condition as when I found them. Seems to me an inherently conservative position. They look at you with horror because actually the discipline you have to acquire to bring things into their proper order and leave them in as good a state as you found them is quite hard. You have to remember to hang up the coat, to put away the things, to leave the room in a comfortable place for those who might follow. So I don't know if that resonates with your descriptions at all, but those are my two questions. One historically on Levitt and the other on to what extent should we stop saying there is no conservative philosophy and start looking for a genuine negative philosophy?
So I think I can answer both the questions at the same time by referring to Strauss. I think that yes, Strauss was dissatisfied with Levitt's turn to the cross, the Holy Cross, in the sense that he is also a student of Heidegger, and he is also really fascinated with this very idea of a return to the ancients, and to the notion of uprooting the ancients. Returning to the ancients is not simply tracing back their influences, but it's finding to put yourself once again in the same position. And he clearly recognizes very early that this Heideggerian position is anti-Christian in the very sense that it's non-historical, and the first kind of historicism that you find is for Strauss the Christian history, because even if it's a history of revelation, it's a history with a starting point, and if you're born before this starting point, then you don't have access to it. And so coming to the second question, I think that opposite to Heidegger, what Strauss ends up, for a very long time, he believes he can find something in this uprooting. He can find an affirmation, something dogmatic. But what he ends up finding is even more than Plato or Aristoteles. He finds Socrates, and he finds the idea that natural law is something we have to posit somehow. Is that the very act of philosophizing starts with both the positing that what you have in front of you might not be the whole thing, but at the same time it's something you have to posit because you don't know what is the whole thing. And he ends up with this notion of natural law as something that does exist and should exist, but that you can't define. You can always, the only person that is able to tell if something was just or not, he says this multiple times in natural right in history, and that's the same thing for Aron. And someone named Sophie Marcotte-Chenard has done an amazing job applying this in a paper about Aron and Oakeshott and Strauss and their reading of Thucydides. Is that it's only the historian that is going to be able to say that if someone acted justly or not, because you need the retrospect. Natural right and philosophy gives you the question to ask, and the idea that order is there and that you can find order, but you can't find it in a substantive way. It doesn't give you a master plan or something to follow. So I really think that yes, it's a kind of negative philosophy, and I think that it's why all of them do reject traditionalism in some sense. Is because traditionalism, if tradition is firmly implemented in society, traditionalism can be negative. You can stick to just reminding people about the tradition, but as soon as tradition is not something obvious to anyone, and maybe it was never the case, then traditionalism can't be only negative. You not only have to remind people about the tradition, you have to enact the tradition. and you have to act positively to one tradition. And I think that's why they are maybe not the first, because I'm not knowledgeable enough to say if that's the case, but that they are the first kind of conservative I know that rejected traditionalism, whereas for a lot of other conservative philosophers, traditionalism was the backbone of conservatism.
Thank you. So I see, Aino, you have a question, so please put it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's very interesting. I can never get tired of presentations on Strauss and Oakeshott and Arnold. I have two sort of very small and related questions. The first one is simply a question from my understanding. I didn't quite get the argument, even though I followed the quotes quite carefully, I think, why this conception of conservative democracy is not traditionalist, because it seems to me that everything that you listed, law, elite rule, liberal education, are sort of inherited, right? Inherited practices, and perhaps peaceful alternation of power, you could say it's a means to maintain those inherited practices. So I didn't quite get that, and I think I get it in the Strauss's case better than in Oakshott's, but in general I don't quite follow that. The other thing would be methodologically, I'm always a little bit careful when I see works on conservatism which deal with listings. Conservatism at this particular time had X, Y, Z characteristics, right? And here we have this Auflistung, say the German side, like a list of things. And I'm not sure which one of those lists, they could be totally temporary, totally contingent, they could indicate something far deeper, and I don't know, when I operate with lists, I don't know how to distinguish between the two. If they are totally contingent, then perhaps this whole conservative democracy exercise should not exercise us too much, other than antiquarian interest. But maybe they point towards something totally different, but not by themselves. So could you address this question of sort of contingent characteristics versus more sort of principled characteristics? I could totally imagine, for example, if we have a conception of regime in a kind of Montesquieuian way, that the regime has a form and a principle, and all conservatives and liberals and socialists could agree at a particular point in time that the best regime shares the same form, right? A kind of liberal democracy. But the best regime that we have in mind is different. The principle is different. So therefore, we are talking about this. We seem to be in agreement, but in fact, we are totally talking about different regimes altogether, even though they happen to share the same form at this point in time. So then all agreement in this case would be an optical illusion, but we have to discover that principle ourselves. So yeah, just if you could address it for me, I'd be very, very grateful. And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. I think to answer quite fast and not waste too much time for Christian. I think the two questions are tied in. I think that I don't want to provide a definition in terms of characteristic of conservatism during that period. I really do this for conservative democracy in the sense of the salient characteristics they see in their own period of time. But I don't have any strong opinion about the fact that, yes, it's probably just very limited in time, and it already started withering away both after 68, May 68. That's really in all their body of works. You really see that they feel like something has changed after this point in time, and not only related to a change in the political culture of the youth, but also what we know usually designate as neoliberalism, was also very dubious of what was happening in post-industrial societies. So I think I don't think I am really pinpointing a kind of ideal conservative democracy that conservatives should be able to establish. What I'm really trying to say is that those are the characteristics that help those thinkers think that this kind of institutions were stable. And so they gave a conservative interpretation of this, is that those regimes can be stable and democracy can be satisfactory from a conservative standpoint because of these characteristics. But I don't want to claim more than this, so I'm satisfied with this. And then the second point about traditionalism is that I don't really totally want to say that those thinkers are not anti-traditionalist. And I think that in many ways they want to conserve the tradition, and they want to help all the tradition. But what they don't want to do is that they don't want to do this by claiming a normative power for the tradition. They don't think if we want to preserve a conserved tradition, we should not start with tradition. I think that that's what I'm trying to say, in the sense that they don't think that it's very clear for Leo Strauss. He doesn't see the evolutionary defense of tradition as a good way to defend tradition. He thinks, to the total opposite, it's a terrible way to defend it. But that's the same for Oakeshott, that really switched it. He was much closer to a traditionalist reading before the middle of the 50s. And then he switched at the idea that, no, if we have to defend tradition, we have to defend it as the product of free individuals. Is that it's because people choose those traditions, because people acted in this tradition, that's what gives them value, not the historical process, not the, or basically you would say that for him, religion is not something that is, the power of the religious tradition is not to be found in the fact that it was given to man. It is to be found in the fact that people believe, but much like authority in many ways. Is that he sees the way to defend or to ground or love or anything of tradition outside of tradition, at least on the political level, that can be totally different on the religious personal level of these thinkers. I hope I answered at least a bit of it.
Yes. Thank you very much. We've got, I think, about 2 minutes, because we started 2 minutes late. And so I just want to ask a question in a minute or less, and you have a minute or less to answer, which probably would be hard to do. But I mean, what I want to say is that I think you've done a marvelous job in showing how this Cold War and slightly later conservatism is different to conservatism sort of seen in the tradition going back to Burke, and is also something which now has passed. So the past tense in your title, which brings to my mind 2 questions. One is, how would you say it if you'd have a longer tradition of conservatism, which I know a lot of people don't like, but if one could think of conservatism going back, let's say, to Aristotle. And secondly, besides this historical point, is there something which comes out of what you say for people interested in conservative philosophy now? So let's see if you could answer that in a minute.
Yes. So, well, what I think is that there is some kind of connection with this broader conservative tradition going back to Aristotle, but the real difference is, I would say, it's really clear in our home, but it's also the same for all these free thinkers, is that all of them do have a historical consciousness, and I think that it is the thing they are fighting against, is the very idea that history is always on the move, and history is always on the move is not only the idea that well, a city can have a golden age, and we should protect this golden age, and it's going to move. No, it's the idea that whatever is happening to your own political community, something is happening in the world, and the march of history is something that is happening in the world. And I think that they are very conscious of it. And what was the important thing for them is that what was giving a unitary historical trend to the world at the time was the opposition between the West and the East and communism. And so they had a very clear historical consciousness of this. Whereas that for Aristotle, or even Aquinas, or you could say that Aquinas probably had a historical but theological historical consciousness. But the idea that you could always apply the common good or discuss about all this, because you could be quite ignorant of the outside factors. The outside factors simply had to be left out. And I think that's what changed. And I think that's what's interesting in this period.
Yeah, thank you very much. I won't press on with the other things, but may we thank you again for the paper and also the very full answers to the questions, and move straight on then